Before the arrival of Europeans, the island of Cuba was inhabited by indigenous peoples who had developed ways of life adapted to the tropical climate of the Caribbean. For centuries, they cultivated the land, navigated its coasts, and built rich cultures with deep traditions. However, after Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492, their world changed forever. Today we're going to travel back in time to discover who they really were, how they lived, and why their legacy is far more alive than many people think. To understand the original inhabitants of Cuba, it's important to recognize that they were not all the same. The island was home to a diverse mix of cultures with different lifestyles and levels of development. The three main groups were the Taino, the Siboney, often linked to the Siboney, and the Guanahatave. The Taino were the largest and most socially complex group. They were part of the Arawakan-speaking peoples who migrated from South America into the Caribbean centuries before European contact. They primarily inhabited eastern and central Cuba and lived in organized villages called yucayeques, led by chiefs known as caciques. These communities could include hundreds of people and had structured social systems and advanced agricultural practices. The Taino cultivated staple crops such as cassava, yucca, which they used to make cassava bread, a key part of their diet. They also grew maize, corn, chili peppers, tobacco, and other plants. Their villages consisted of circular houses made from wood and palm leaves, arranged around a central plaza used for ceremonies and games. The Siboney likely represented an earlier wave of inhabitants. They mainly lived in coastal areas and relied heavily on fishing, shellfish gathering, and hunting small animals. Compared to the Taino, they practiced little agriculture and had smaller, less permanent settlements. The Guanahatave were probably the oldest and most distinct group. They lived primarily in western Cuba and had a lifestyle based almost entirely on hunting, fishing, and gathering. Spanish chroniclers noted that they spoke a different language from the Taino, suggesting a separate cultural origin. These differences show that Cuba's indigenous past was far more diverse and complex than often portrayed. The indigenous peoples of Cuba developed a way of life closely tied to their environment. Among them, the Taino stood out for their agricultural ingenuity. Their most important innovation was the canuco system, a method of farming that was highly sustainable. Instead of clearing large areas of land, they built raised mounds of soil where they planted multiple crops together. Cassava was the primary crop, but they also grew sweet potatoes, maize, beans, and squash. This system helped retain moisture, reduce soil erosion, and maintain soil fertility, allowing them to farm long-term without damaging the land. The sea also played a major role in their survival. They used woven nets and wooden fish traps in coastal waters, allowing them to catch fish and turtles efficiently. They also hunted animals such as the hutia, a native rodent still found in Cuba, and iguanas. They played a ceremonial ball game called bati, using a rubber-like ball and striking it with parts of the body other than the hands, similar in concept to Mesoamerican ball games. They were also skilled navigators. Their large dugout canoes, carved from single tree trunks, could carry dozens of people and allowed travel between islands, maintaining trade networks across the Caribbean. For these indigenous cultures, the natural and spiritual worlds were deeply connected. Everything from rivers to trees was believed to have a spirit. At the center of their beliefs were the semillas. Semillas were both deities and the physical objects representing them, often carved from wood, stone, or shell. The Taino believed these objects housed spiritual power. There were semillas for agriculture, weather, fertility, and protection. One of the most important was yucahu, associated with cassava and sustenance. Another was huracan, the spirit of destructive storms, whose name is the origin of the modern word hurricane. Spiritual communication was led by a figure known as the Bahik, a healer and spiritual guide. One of their most important rituals was the Cahoba ceremony, in which leaders inhaled a hallucinogenic powder made from seeds to enter a trance and communicate with the spiritual world. Tobacco also played a sacred role, used in rituals to purify spaces and connect with the divine. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 marked a turning point. The most devastating impact came not from warfare, but from disease. Having lived in isolation, indigenous populations had no immunity to illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases spread rapidly and caused massive population decline. The encomienda system further worsened conditions. Indigenous people were forced into labor in mines and plantations under harsh conditions. Combined with disease, forced labor, and social disruption, the population declined dramatically within decades. European livestock also damaged traditional agriculture by destroying conoco fields, contributing to food shortages. Within roughly 50 years, many colonial records described the indigenous population as nearly extinct, although this was not entirely accurate. Despite this devastation, resistance did occur. One of the most famous figures was Hatui, a leader originally from Hispaniola. He fled to Cuba to warn its inhabitants about the Spanish. He organized resistance using guerrilla tactics, but was eventually captured. Before his execution in 1512, he reportedly refused conversion to Christianity, after learning Spaniards would also go to heaven, choosing instead not to join them. Later, Guama led continued resistance between 1522 and 1532. He and his followers retreated into remote mountainous regions and maintained independent communities. Although eventually defeated, their resistance showed that indigenous resistance was strong and persistent. For a long time, it was believed that Cuba's indigenous people had disappeared completely. However, modern research shows that many survived and mixed with African and European populations. Today, their influence remains visible in Cuban culture, from foods like cassava to language, traditions, and identity. The indigenous peoples of Cuba didn't simply vanish. Their legacy lives on, hidden in traditions, culture, and history, proving that even when civilizations fall, their impact never truly disappears.